Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. I'd love to know. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, let's jump in. You've probably seen warships in movies, but there's one out there that's like nothing you've ever imagined. This ship doesn't just float in the ocean. It can make entire countries disappear. It looks like any other warship at first, but this one holds a terrifying secret. It can erase entire cities, leaving nothing behind. What was once a symbol of defense is now the most dangerous weapon in the world, and it's crossing lines no one thought possible. The world is on the edge of a new kind of war, one where survival isn't guaranteed. If this warship didn't exist, the world might still be standing on shaky ground, but at least there would be a chance for diplomacy and peace. Without it, countries could focus on working together instead of living in fear of the unknown. But now, things are different. With the power to erase entire populations in the blink of an eye, the world has entered a new era where a single mistake could lead to disaster. Every nation is now asking themselves, what happens if the ship turns against us? And worse, what happens if no one can stop it? This warship didn't just appear overnight. It was the product of years of secret research built by the brightest minds on the planet. Its creators had the best of intentions. They wanted to build something that could protect the world. They wanted to ensure that no country, no leader, could threaten the peace. What started as an idea for a stronger defense force quickly evolved into something much darker. The warship was fitted with technology that no one had ever seen before. It could fire lasers strong enough to cut through mountains and launch missiles that could wipe out entire cities with a single shot. At first, people didn't realize the consequences. They thought it was just another weapon for the military. But the truth was far more terrifying. The warship's power wasn't just in its weapons, it was in its systems. Everything aboard was designed to make the ship virtually unstoppable. It was built with layers of protection so thick that nothing could break through. Its engines were powered by a new form of energy, clean, efficient, and incredibly powerful. The ship could move at incredible speeds, faster than any other warship in the world, and it could strike from miles away, hitting targets with pinpoint accuracy. But there was one problem. No one truly understood how dangerous it was until it was too late. The weapons, once tested, showed their full potential. And soon, the leaders in charge of it realized they had created something they couldn't control. The warship's first real mission wasn't supposed to be anything major. It was just a routine patrol, a chance to show off its capabilities to the world. But things quickly escalated. The mission was supposed to be a simple exercise to scare off an enemy nation that had been causing trouble on the border. But when orders came through to take action, the situation turned deadly. The ship fired its weapons, just a warning shot at first. But the blast didn't stop. It tore through the enemy's defenses and ripped apart an entire city. The destruction was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. What had been meant as a demonstration became an international disaster. And with that, the warship had crossed the line. The world would never look at peace the same way again. The moment the city was wiped off the map, the world fell into chaos. News of the devastation spread like wildfire, and within hours, governments and citizens alike were reeling from the shock. The very nature of warfare had just changed, and no one knew how to process it. People who had once believed in the power of diplomacy now feared that this warship could end the world as they knew it. The United Nations called for an emergency summit. Leaders from across the globe gathered in a secure location, trying to figure out how to respond to what had happened. Many were in disbelief. They couldn't imagine that such a powerful weapon had been unleashed, especially without any real warning. There were urgent calls to disarm the ship, to stop its production, and to dismantle the technology that made it possible. But there was a problem. The warship wasn't the only one of its kind. Other nations, fearing for their survival, began to scramble to develop similar technology, fearing that if they didn't have it, they would be left vulnerable. The arms race had gone into overdrive. Despite the outrage, a small but vocal group of world leaders argued that this new weapon could bring peace by instilling fear. If one country was willing to wipe out an entire city, surely others would be too afraid to attack. But this argument was quickly rejected by most. The problem wasn't about deterrence, it was about control. Who had the right to wield such power? And more importantly, who could stop it if it was misused? In the midst of this growing international panic, a new development shocked everyone even more. The warship had been ordered back to port for repairs, but its commander, Captain Elena Voss, was not giving up without a fight. Her orders had been to serve, and the consequences of failure were clear: the end of her career and likely her life. Captain Voss was no stranger to the power of the warship. She knew how devastating its firepower could be. But what she didn't fully grasp was the moral weight of it. She had always believed in following orders, but after seeing the destruction firsthand, she began to question everything. Captain Voss had been raised in a military family. From a young age, she was taught that duty came first, and that the protection of her country and her people was the highest calling. She had excelled in her training, earning top marks in every aspect of her military education. Her rise through the ranks had been swift, and by the time she was in command of the warship, she had earned the trust of her superiors. To her, the warship was the ultimate tool of defense. It was designed to keep the world safe. But now she began to realize that it had the potential to destroy everything. She spent sleepless nights thinking about the aftermath of the mission, the look on the faces of the people who had been forced to evacuate their homes in the city. Families, children, the elderly, all lost to a single moment of warfare. The warship had not just killed military personnel, it had killed innocent people. She couldn't forget the screams, the panic, the complete and utter devastation that followed. But what was she supposed to do now? To refuse an order meant risking her life and career, maybe even starting a war. But to obey blindly, knowing what she had seen, was something she couldn't do. The moral dilemma was tearing her apart. Her fellow officers on board the warship began to sense her inner turmoil. Some of them shared her concerns, but most were too focused on the mission to care. The warship was their tool of power, and as long as they followed orders, they would be untouchable. But Voss knew that the moment they used the warship again, the world would be forever changed. One night, as she stared at the dark ocean stretching out before her, she realized that she couldn't keep running from the truth. She had to do something. But what? Could she find a way to dismantle the ship's systems? Could she sabotage its weapons, or even abandon her mission altogether? But in doing so, she would risk losing everything she had worked for, and she wasn't sure if she was prepared to make that sacrifice. Sixth topic: the global response. Meanwhile, the world was not standing still. As soon as the destruction of the city was confirmed, countries that had previously been hesitant about developing their own advanced military technologies now ramped up their efforts. Governments, desperate to avoid being at a disadvantage, accelerated research into weapons that could rival the warship's power. Some nations were already close to completing their own versions of the warship, and soon there would be multiple floating cities of destruction, each capable of wiping out millions in a single strike. Diplomatic relations began to break down quickly. Alliances that had been built over decades began to crumble under the weight of fear and mistrust. Nations that once worked together now saw each other as threats. Without trust, without the ability to sit down and talk things through, war seemed inevitable. But it wasn't just the global superpowers that were on edge. Smaller nations, those with limited resources and no access to advanced military technology, felt like they were living in a constant state of terror. They knew that if a war broke out, they would be the first to suffer. The sheer scale of the destruction that a warship like this could unleash left no room for hope. For them, the only choice was survival, no matter the cost. As the days passed, the warship became more than just a symbol of military might. It had become a ticking time bomb, and every government knew that its next use would be the spark that ignited the fire. The question wasn't if the warship would be used again, but when. Seventh topic, the tipping point. Back aboard the warship, Captain Voss made a decision. She would not follow orders without understanding the consequences. She knew it was a dangerous move, one that could result in her arrest or worse, but she was no longer willing to be a part of the destruction. As she began to discuss her doubts with trusted members of the crew, they revealed that they too were troubled by what they had witnessed. Some had children back home, and the thought of their families being erased in the blink of an eye terrified them. Together, they started planning a way to disable the warship's weapon systems, something that would delay its next mission long enough for the world to catch its breath. However, this plan came with its own set of challenges. The warship was equipped with a failsafe, a system designed to prevent anyone from shutting it down without direct orders from the highest authorities. The crew would have to work quickly, carefully, and in secret, or risk being caught. As they worked in the shadows, unaware of the growing tension on the world stage, the clock was ticking. The warship was being prepared for its next mission. And this time, it wouldn't be just a demonstration. It would be an act of war. Eighth topic, the countdown begins. The moment the warship was scheduled for its next mission, Captain Voss and her crew knew they were running out of time. They had one shot to stop it. If they failed, the world would change forever, and not in a way anyone could come back from. Every hour brought new urgency, and as they worked, the risk of being discovered grew exponentially. The crew had learned to navigate the warship's complex systems over the course of their missions, but taking down its weapons wasn't as simple as hitting a few switches. The ship's weaponry was integrated into a central command system, a system that was tightly secured. Only those with the highest levels of clearance could access it. For the past few days, Captain Voss and her team had been gathering intel from the lower-level systems. They had found a way to temporarily disable some of the ship's communication lines, which would give them a small window to act. But disabling the weapons themselves was going to be much harder. As Captain Voss paced the command deck, she stared at the holographic displays before her. The mission was just days away. The next target had been chosen, a heavily fortified region in an enemy nation. Intelligence had been gathered, and the strike was to be swift. The plan was to send a message, a warning to the world that anyone who opposed the new global order would be erased. But Captain Voss was no longer sure what kind of message this was sending. She had seen firsthand how the ship's weapons could tear through everything in its path. And now she was faced with a decision that would change her forever. Her mind raced. What if she couldn't stop it? What if the crew's plan failed, and the warship was sent to carry out another strike? The people in that region would be obliterated without mercy, their lives snuffed out by a machine built to keep the peace. But could she stop the very system she was part of? Could she dismantle it without plunging the world into a war of unimaginable proportions? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on her door. It was Lieutenant Kyle Novak, one of her most trusted officers. His face was drawn, eyes wide with concern. Without saying a word, he stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. There was no need for pleasantries. "Captain, it's time," he said quietly. "The team's ready. We're just waiting for your go-ahead." Voss took a deep breath. This was it. If they didn't act now, it might be too late. "Are the systems in place?" she asked. Novak nodded. "We've mapped out the ship's inner workings, and we've found a weak point in the central command system. It's risky, but we think we can pull it off." Voss's mind flashed to the faces of the crew members who had joined her in this dangerous plan. Some of them were young, still in their 20s, new to the dangers of war. Others were veterans, hardened by years of conflict. But all of them shared the same goal: to stop the destruction. They weren't fighting for glory or medals. They were fighting for a chance to live in a world where the warship was no longer a tool of terror. She nodded. "Let's do it. We have to make sure that this mission doesn't go forward. If we don't, there won't be a world left to protect." Novak turned to leave, but Voss stopped him. "Kyle, make sure everyone understands the stakes. This isn't just about saving lives. It's about preventing a global catastrophe. If we fail, there's no going back." "Understood, Captain," Novak replied, his voice resolute. As he left, Voss returned to her thoughts. It was hard to believe that this warship, once hailed as the pinnacle of defense technology, had become the ultimate weapon of destruction. The more she reflected on the past few months, the clearer it became. This warship wasn't just a tool for war. It had become the war itself. And the world was watching, waiting to see who would make the first move. But the real question was, could they stop the cycle before it spiraled out of control? Ninth topic: the internal struggle intensifies. The tension on board the warship was palpable. Each crew member knew the importance of the mission ahead and the consequences of failure. No one could afford to make a mistake. And yet, as the crew members moved through the halls of the ship, there was a deep sense of unease among them. Even those who had supported the captain's decision to disable the weapons were questioning their loyalty to the mission. Some of them had families back home. Others had friends in the nations the warship had targeted. Every person had their own reasons for wanting to see the ship's mission stopped, but in their hearts, they all knew the danger they faced if they were discovered. Lieutenant Novak met with the rest of the crew in the lower levels of the ship. They were the unsung heroes in this operation, the ones tasked with getting to the heart of the ship's systems and shutting them down. But no one had ever attempted anything like this before. They were effectively trying to tamper with the very essence of the warship, its most powerful and lethal weapon. Even if they succeeded, they had no idea what the repercussions might be. The system was built to resist tampering, to detect any unauthorized access. If they triggered an alarm, they would be trapped. "We need to stay focused," Novak said, addressing the group. "The mission is in less than 24 hours. If we don't act now, we won't get another chance." One of the officers, Ensign Lila Hayes, spoke up. "And if we fail, what happens then?" Novak didn't have an answer. No one did. The plan was risky, and the consequences of failure were too great to comprehend. But Voss had been clear. There was no turning back now. The ship had to be stopped. "We have to do what's right," Novak said quietly. "For our families, for the world. We can't let this ship become a weapon of global extinction. It's not just a tool of war anymore. It's a machine that defines who we are as a species. If we allow it to continue, we're telling the world that destruction is our only answer. And I don't believe that's the message we want to send." The officers nodded, understanding the weight of his words. But the truth was, they were all scared. They were scared of what would happen if they failed. They were scared of what would happen if they succeeded. This wasn't just about preventing a war. It was about fundamentally altering the course of human history. And if they were wrong, if they failed, the consequences would be irreversible. 10th topic: the ticking clock. As the warship prepared to set sail for its next mission, the crew was divided. Some were growing increasingly restless, anxious about the path they were about to take. Others felt the gravity of the decision, but were ready to push forward. Captain Voss stood at the helm, watching the crew prepare for the mission ahead. She felt the weight of every life on her shoulders. She wasn't just protecting her people anymore. She was trying to protect the entire world from a fate worse than any war they had ever known. But could she stop the warship before it was too late? And what if her efforts only made things worse? The clock was ticking. The mission was imminent. And with each passing moment, the stakes grew higher. 11th topic: the descent into chaos. The tension on board the warship reached a boiling point. Every member of the crew could feel the pressure weighing down on them. The countdown to the next mission was nearing zero, and each passing moment felt like a step closer to irreversible consequences. For Captain Voss, it felt as though the ship itself was alive, a beast that had broken free from its creator's control and was now making its own rules. She knew that if she didn't act quickly, it would all be over. Not just for the crew, but for the entire world. Captain Voss stood in front of the holographic map that displayed their next target, a fortified region in a rival country, one that had been causing instability on the global stage. It wasn't just a military target. It was a symbolic strike, meant to send a message. "Cross us, and we'll erase you," the warship would tell the world. But Voss was no longer sure what that message was meant to protect. The lines between right and wrong had blurred so much that she couldn't tell which side she was on anymore. What was she protecting? Her country? The world? Or simply her own belief that what she was doing was just? "Captain." Novak's voice snapped her out of her trance. He had been standing quietly next to her for several minutes. She hadn't even noticed him approach. "Yes, Lieutenant?" she asked, her voice strained. "We're ready to go. The crew is in place. The plan is set. Voss nodded slowly. She had ordered him to begin the sabotage of the warship's weapon systems earlier that evening, and now they were on the precipice of executing the plan. But the fear in her gut told her that even if they succeeded in shutting down the ship's weapons, there was no guarantee that they would be able to stop the warship from completing its mission. The global political climate was too volatile. The leaders of other nations were watching closely, and they knew what the stakes were. If this mission was stopped, it could trigger a chain reaction. A war not just between two countries, but between superpowers, each with their own version of the warship. Captain Voss turned away from the map and faced Novak. "We're not just trying to stop the next attack. We're trying to prevent the future from looking like this," she said. Her eyes filled with a mix of determination and doubt. What happens if this warship is allowed to continue? What if every country decides to build one? "We'll be starting a new kind of war," Novak said quietly, his voice thick with the weight of what they were about to do. "One where there's no way out. No more peace talks, just destruction." "Exactly," Voss replied. "And if that's the future we're facing, then we have to ask ourselves, is it worth it? Are we willing to be the ones who stop this, at whatever cost?" Novak met her gaze, and for a moment there was silence between them. He nodded, his resolve unwavering. "We'll do what we have to do, Captain." With that, Voss turned away, her mind racing. The plan had been set in motion, and there was no going back now. In just a few hours, the warship would be launched toward its target. If they could disable the weapons in time, they might be able to delay the attack. But it was a long shot. The only way to truly stop it was to prevent the mission from happening at all. And that meant somehow getting past the fail-safes that had been put in place to keep the crew from making such a decision. There was no guarantee that she and her team would survive this. The crew had been working non-stop for hours, and fatigue was starting to show. Lieutenant Novak and his team had been hacking into the warship's internal systems, carefully bypassing the security protocols that had been set up to protect the ship from unauthorized access. The more they worked, the more they realized how deeply the ship had been integrated into a global system of military control. It wasn't just a warship, it was a key piece in a much larger geopolitical strategy. Whoever controlled the ship controlled the fate of nations. "We're in," Novak said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and nervousness. "We've accessed the power grid for the weapons system. We can disable the energy flow, but it's not permanent. It will take time for the ship's systems to reset." "But time is something we don't have," Voss replied, as she looked over his shoulder at the screens, her heart pounding in her chest. "If the weapon systems reset before we're done, it's game over. The mission will go forward." "We're almost there," Novak assured her. "But we need to be fast. Once we cut the power to the main weapon core, the ship's backup systems will kick in within minutes. We'll have to act before that happens." Voss's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the console. Her mind flashed back to the faces of the innocent people she had seen in the destroyed city weeks earlier. Could she really stop this? Could they really change the course of history by disabling the ship? Or would they simply be throwing themselves into an even darker chapter? The tension in the control room grew with every passing second. The hum of machinery, the soft beeping of alarms, the quiet conversations between crew members, it all felt suffocating. Every sound seemed to grow louder as time passed, reminding them of the pressure building inside the ship. Then came the moment they had feared. A shrill alarm went off, slicing through the tension like a knife. It was the fail-safe alert. "They've detected the breach," Voss said, her voice tight with panic. "They know we're trying to stop the mission." "How much time do we have?" Novak asked, his fingers flying across the console as he desperately tried to override the alarms. "Less than 5 minutes," Voss said, as she took a deep breath and forced herself to stay calm. She had to think quickly. The plan was no longer going according to schedule, and they were running out of options. The only thing they could do now was hope that their last-ditch effort would work. As Novak continued to work, Captain Voss pulled out a secure communicator from her pocket. She had to contact the highest levels of command and warn them of what was happening. The mission, she knew, had to be stopped, not just for the crew's sake, but for the sake of the world. But as she tapped in the emergency signal, a cold dread washed over her. The message she was about to send could either stop everything or make things worse than she could ever imagine. "Captain," Novak's voice was urgent, pulling Voss's attention back to the console. "The backup systems are coming online. We're out of time. If we don't disable the core now, it'll reset everything, and the weapons will be fully operational again." Voss's mind raced. The world outside was already teetering on the brink. If she failed to act, the warship would carry out its mission, and that would be the moment the world plunged into total chaos. Once the ship fired, there would be no turning back. And if they succeeded in disabling the weapon systems, what would that mean? Would it stop the warship's mission, or would it start a new kind of war? One where nations would feel forced to retaliate in kind? The crew's future was now directly tied to the success or failure of this final operation. Voss gripped the console tightly, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like 1,000 tons of steel. This wasn't just about stopping a mission. This was about deciding whether humanity would ever return to peace, or whether they were doomed to live in a world defined by ever-accelerating destruction. The countdown to catastrophe ticked steadily, its steady rhythm like the beating of a drum, leading toward a final, irreversible clash. Captain Voss's fingers trembled as she stared at the holographic screen in front of her. The ship's power core was beginning to surge with energy. The backup systems were up and running, and the fail-safes were locking in place. Her team had just a few minutes left before the ship's devastating weapons would come online, and once they did, the mission could not be stopped. The global implications would be catastrophic. The air in the command room was thick with tension, each member of the crew working furiously to prevent the unthinkable. The time to act had come, but the moment was slipping away. Every second mattered, and as the fail-safe alarms blared louder, Voss realized that there was no way to fix everything without taking a final risk. The warship was on the verge of becoming a nuclear fuse, ready to detonate in a manner that would change the course of human history. "Captain, we can't stop the weapons system." Novak's voice was tight with frustration. "It's locked down. The only option left is to shut down the entire ship's core. If we do that, we lose everything: the ship, our lives, and the chance to stop the escalation." Voss looked at him, her face pale with the weight of his words. If they deactivated the core, it wasn't just the weapon systems that would go offline. It was the entire warship, its communication systems, navigation, even the engines that powered it. The ship would become a floating hulk, vulnerable to any other military force that chose to pursue them. The mission would fail, but the world would never look the same again. In that moment, Voss knew what needed to be done. There was no room for hesitation. "Do it," she commanded, her voice firm despite the inner turmoil she felt. "Deactivate the core." There was no turning back now. The crew quickly scrambled to follow her order, working frantically to initiate the shutdown sequence for the warship's central reactor. They weren't just risking their lives now. They were going against everything they had been taught to believe. The core, the heart of the warship, was the embodiment of humanity's reach for power, its attempt to control the uncontrollable. Deactivating it meant exposing themselves to the unknown, a breakdown of systems they could never have imagined. Yet Voss knew it was the only chance they had. "We'll need a minute to get the power off," Novak said urgently. "Once we initiate the shutdown, there's a failsafe in place. If we don't stop it in time, it'll trigger a catastrophic overload." As the minutes dragged by like hours, Captain Voss watched her crew work in synchrony, their faces grim with the weight of what they were doing. Each movement was deliberate, each breath measured. They were all too aware that if they failed, the world would descend into a new era of conflict, one where peace would no longer be a possibility. The mission had to fail, but the fallout from that failure might be just as devastating. "Captain, we've triggered the shutdown sequence," Novak said, his voice barely audible over the hum of machinery. "But we're not out of the woods yet. We have 30 seconds before the core goes into emergency reboot." Voss's mind raced. 30 seconds wasn't enough time. The warship's power could surge back into action with terrifying speed. Once that happened, there would be no more options, no more second chances. The ship's systems would be restored, and the world would be faced with an unstoppable juggernaut of destruction. "We have to buy more time," she muttered to herself, her gaze shifting to the battle-worn officers around her. They were all in this together, and they all had their roles to play. The crew wasn't just stopping the ship from firing. They were buying humanity its final chance at survival. "Captain," one of the officers said, breaking through her thoughts, "the reactor is beginning to power down. But we're seeing signs of a backup system activating. We don't know if it's the weapons or the core itself." This was the moment of truth. The warship's failsafes had been designed to prevent mutiny, to prevent anyone from derailing the mission. The central reactor wasn't just a power source. It was the ship's beating heart. If the reactor was destroyed or disabled completely, it would be irreversible. But if they allowed the backup systems to come online, the warship would be operational again. Captain Voss gripped the console tightly, the weight of every decision pressing down on her. "Novak, what are the options? Can we override the backup system?" "We could," Novak said, "but it's risky. Overriding the backup triggers another round of safety protocols. If we get caught, if we make one mistake, it will trigger a lockdown. The ship will lock down, and we won't be able to shut it down manually again. The weapons will fire." Voss closed her eyes, the pressure building until she felt as though the walls were closing in on her. Every fiber of her being screamed to take the chance, to push past the fear and to make the hard choice. If they didn't act now, if they didn't override the backup system, the warship would be unstoppable. It would fire, and the next target would be erased from the map. "We override it," Voss ordered, her voice a steel blade cutting through the chaos. Now, we don't have time to debate. Novak nodded, and without another word, his fingers flew across the console. There was no hesitation now, only action. The officers watched with bated breath as he bypassed layer after layer of security. The seconds stretched into infinity, each one carrying with it the weight of the entire world. If Novak failed, the mission would proceed. If he succeeded, they would have a chance at survival. The countdown continued, each number ticking closer to zero, echoing like a clock at the edge of the abyss. Voss could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat a reminder of the impossible decision she had made. She could hear her own voice in her head, telling herself that she had done the right thing. But in the back of her mind, doubt crept in. Was this truly the right choice? Had she just condemned everyone to a war they couldn't possibly survive? "Captain," Novak said, his voice filled with urgency. "We've overridden the backup systems. The core's shutting down, but we're going to need a few more minutes to ensure everything is completely offline." A wave of relief washed over Voss, but it was brief. The core was shutting down, yes, but the mission had not been fully derailed yet. If the backup systems were still trying to come online, they weren't truly out of danger. The warship was a beast, and it had its own way of adapting to threats. This was a battle of wits now, a race against time, and a war against technology. But Captain Voss couldn't afford to think too much about what might go wrong. She had made her choice, and now they had to see it through. The crew was her responsibility. The world's future was in their hands. "We don't have time to waste," she said, her voice steady, commanding. "Keep pushing. If we don't finish this now, there won't be a tomorrow." The final moments of this mission were upon them, and Voss knew that whatever happened next would be the defining moment of her life. Could she stop the warship and prevent global catastrophe? Or would the world pay the ultimate price for humanity's ambition? Certainly. Here's the continuation and conclusion of the story, wrapping up the high-stakes situation Captain Voss and her crew are facing. 15th topic: the final act. The tension in the control room had never been more suffocating. Captain Voss stared at the countdown clock. Less than 2 minutes left. Every second felt like a lifetime, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The crew had done everything they could to stop the warship, but they were now deep into uncharted territory. The systems were failing. The reactor was almost offline, but that didn't mean they were out of danger. Far from it. "Captain," Novak said, his voice hoarse with the strain of the operation, "we're down to the last override. If we don't cut this last security loop, we're going to lose everything." Voss swallowed hard, the pressure mounting on her chest. They were moments away from deactivating the warship's final failsafe, the last line of defense that would bring the entire operation to a screeching halt if triggered. The crew had fought tirelessly to get to this point, but they had no way of knowing how the ship's automated systems would respond. If they triggered the lockdown, they'd lose everything. But if they didn't, the warship would be back in full operational power, its mission continuing as planned. The weapons would fire, the destruction would commence, and the consequences would be catastrophic. She took a deep breath, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Do it. Override the final loop. We need to end this." Novak didn't hesitate. His fingers danced across the console, inputting the final sequence of commands. Voss watched the screen with bated breath, her heart hammering in her chest. Each keystroke felt like it could be the one that decided the fate of the world. The seconds ticked down. 15, 12, 8, and then the unthinkable happened. The countdown stopped. The whole room fell into an eerie silence. It was as if time itself had paused, holding its breath, unsure of what had just transpired. The alarms that had been blaring for what seemed like hours went quiet. The lights, which had been flashing ominously, stilled. The warship had, finally, been disarmed. The fail-safe systems had been overridden, and the weapons had been shut down for good. For the first time in days, Captain Voss felt a rush of relief wash over her. "We did it," Novak whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. "We actually did it." Voss took a moment to steady herself. The relief was palpable, but it was tempered with something deeper, a sense of awe at what they had just accomplished. They had stopped the warship from firing, had potentially saved millions of lives. But the warship was not the only threat that loomed over them. There was still the matter of the global powers watching, the political ramifications of what they had done. The crew had defied orders, destroyed a weapon of mass destruction, and risked everything to stop a war. But the world wouldn't just forgive them. This was only the beginning of the fallout. "Captain, the system is showing us something strange," one of the officers spoke up, breaking the silence. "There's a communication signal coming through. It's encrypted." Voss turned sharply toward the officer. The last thing she wanted now was to deal with more surprises. "Put it through," she said, her voice tense. She needed answers, needed to know who was on the other end of this transmission. A few moments later, the screen flickered, and a cold, authoritative voice filled the room. "Captain Voss," the voice said, its tone emotionless and calculating. "I must admit, I didn't expect you to succeed, but it seems you've made your choice." Voss's blood ran cold. She recognized that voice. It was General Blaine, the head of the Global Defense Council, the very man who had authorized the creation of the warship, the architect of this destruction. "We've been watching," Blaine continued. "You've made a bold move, Captain. But do you think this will go unnoticed? Do you think the world will simply let you stop what's been set in motion?" Voss's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "This was never about following orders, General. It was about stopping a war before it began. You wanted to use that ship to intimidate the world, to erase entire nations. I couldn't let that happen." The voice on the screen remained calm, almost too calm. "You've made a dangerous enemy today, Captain. The warship wasn't just a tool of war. It was a symbol of peace, a symbol of control. Without it, the balance of power shifts. And now the world is destabilized." Voss felt the weight of his words. They were true, in a sense. The warship had been a deterrent, an ultimate force that no one dared challenge. Without it, she wasn't sure what the next step for the world would be. Would countries rush to fill the power vacuum? Would conflict spiral out of control in a way they had never seen before? "Let them destabilize," Voss replied, her voice firmer now, more certain. "Maybe that's what the world needs. Peace built on the fear of weapons is not peace. It's just a fragile truce waiting to break. If we keep going down this path, There won't be a world left to fight over. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out. Voss could feel the tension building in the room. Then Blaine's voice cut through once more, colder than ever. You will regret this decision, Captain. The warship wasn't the end of the power struggle. It was the beginning. And now, you will see what happens when that power is lost. The screen went black. Voss stood still for a moment, the weight of the conversation sinking in. She didn't need to be told that this wasn't over. They had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. The political consequences would be severe. There were already reports of other nations mobilizing their forces. Some would see this as a threat. Others would see it as an opportunity. Either way, the world had just been thrown into a new era, one that would likely be marked by chaos and uncertainty. She turned to her crew, her voice steady but resolute. This isn't over. The world may be destabilized, but we've taken the first step toward breaking free of the cycle of destruction. Now, we need to make sure this doesn't turn into another war. The crew nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the situation. They had taken a stand, but now they would have to defend that stand against all the forces in the world who wouldn't hesitate to tear them down. Prepare the ship for re-entry, Voss ordered. We're going to need all the support we can get. This is only the beginning. As the crew went to work, Voss stood at the helm, staring out into the vast expanse of space. The stars seemed distant, cold, yet in their depths she could see the flicker of hope. They had done the impossible. They had stopped the warship. But in doing so, they had opened a new chapter. And the question now was, would humanity be able to survive the consequences? And with that, the story comes to an end for now. The world is thrown into uncertainty, but the crew's actions have set the stage for what might be a turning point in history. The consequences are far from clear, and the battle for peace is far from over. Let me know if you'd like to continue exploring this world further. And with that, the story comes to an end for now. The world is thrown into uncertainty, but the crew's actions have set the stage for what might be a turning point in history. The consequences are far from clear, and the battle for peace is far from over. Let me know if you'd like to continue exploring this world further.